The story does not begin on a beach or beneath crashing waves frozen forever in celluloid. It begins much later in silence. In the final years of her life, Deborah Kerr spoke less often, and when she did, she chose her words with the same care that once defined every gesture on screen. Friends noticed how memory returned to her not as nostalgia, but as weight. Among those memories, one name surfaced again and again, not with scandal, not with bitterness, but with an honesty that startled those who heard it. Burt Lancaster. To the world, he was a symbol of unrestrained masculinity, of physical power and cinematic bravado. To Deborah Kerr, he was something far more unsettling and far more human. By the time she allowed herself to speak openly, decades had passed since the cameras stopped rolling on their most famous collaboration. The image of them locked in an embrace on the shore had long since become legend, studied, replayed, romanticized until it no longer seemed to belong to real people at all. Yet what Kerr revealed near the end of her life stripped that legend of its polish. She did not dismantle it with anger. She dismantled it with clarity. What shocked listeners was not what she confessed, but what she refused to invent. There was no secret affair hidden from the public, no forbidden romance that ended in regret. The truth, she suggested, was far more uncomfortable than fantasy. Deborah Kerr had always lived by restraint. Long before Hollywood, discipline shaped her body and her mind. Ballet training taught her control, injury taught her loss, and early success taught her how easily admiration could erase the person beneath it. By the time she arrived in Hollywood, she had already learned how to survive by holding something back. That instinct protected her, but it also placed her in stark contrast to Burt Lancaster. Where she measured, he surged. Where she contained, he exploded. Their collision on screen created electricity, but behind the scenes it demanded endurance. Kerr described Lancaster as a man who never lowered his volume. His presence filled rooms before he spoke, his energy demanding attention whether it was welcomed or not. Directors admired it, audiences fed on it, but colleagues felt its cost. Working beside him required strength of a different kind. He challenged authority openly, pushed scripts, questioned motives, and refused to soften himself for anyone's comfort. To Kerr, this was not cruelty. It was compulsion. He did not know how to be smaller. And that, she implied, was both his gift and his burden. The unsettling part of her revelation lay in what she saw beneath his confidence. Kerr spoke of anger, not directed outward in violence, but turned inward against limitation itself. Lancaster could not tolerate restraint, not from studios, not from directors, not from the inevitability that time imposes on all bodies. His reliance on physical power made him fearless, but also made him fragile. When strength defines identity, weakness becomes annihilation. Kerr sensed this long before age proved her right. She understood that the intensity audiences adored was fueled by a constant struggle against being contained. For her, standing opposite Lancaster was not a romantic temptation, but a psychological trial. She admired his brilliance and respected his honesty, yet she kept her distance. That distance was deliberate. She recognized that surrendering to his force would mean losing something essential in herself. In a world that demanded actresses soften, yield, and conform, Kerr chose integrity over indulgence. She allowed connection without collapse. That decision, she later suggested, was misunderstood by audiences who wanted passion without consequence. As she aged, Kerr watched Lancaster confront the slow betrayal of his own body. The irony struck her as merciless. A man who trusted his physicality above all else was forced to face its failure. This decline, she believed, wounded him more deeply than any professional disappointment ever could. It stripped away certainty and exposed the fear he had outrun for decades. Her reflections were not accusations. They were elegies for a man whose greatest strength left him unprepared for his own vulnerability. What Deborah Kerr ultimately offered was not a revelation meant to shock, but a truth meant to humanize. She refused to sanctify Lancaster, but she also refused to condemn him. Greatness, she implied, is rarely gentle. It demands proximity to chaos, and those who stand nearby must decide whether to absorb it or step back. Kerr stepped back, and in doing so preserve herself, even if it meant allowing the world to misunderstand the nature of what they shared. Near the end of her life, as illness narrowed her world and silence grew more frequent, Kerr carried this understanding with quiet acceptance. She had lived among legends and seen the cost of becoming one. The truth she revealed was not about a man on a beach, frozen in an eternal embrace. It was about two artists who met at full force, raised each other's standards, and walked away intact because they knew when intensity became too dangerous to touch. Deborah Kerr did not emerge from Hollywood fully formed, luminous and composed by accident. Her restraint was learned long before cameras followed her movements, shaped in a childhood where structure was not a luxury, but necessity. Born in Scotland and raised in the shadow of loss after her father died from wartime injuries, she grew up understanding that stability could vanish without warning. Her mother responded to that fragility with discipline, education, and an insistence on control. From an early age, Deborah learned that emotion, if left untended, could become dangerous. Control became her refuge. Ballet offered her a language for that control. At Sadler's Wells, she was taught that every gesture mattered, that the body must obey intention, and that beauty came from restraint rather than excess. The injury that ended her hopes of becoming a professional dancer did not remove that discipline. It redirected it. Acting became an extension of ballet, not a rejection of it. She carried posture, stillness, and precision into every role. Even when emotion surged beneath the surface, she allowed it to appear only in carefully measured ways. Audiences mistook this for coldness or distance. It was in fact a deeply personal survival strategy. When she transitioned from British cinema to Hollywood, Deborah Kerr entered an industry that preferred women to be easily categorized. Innocent, seductive, fragile, dangerous. She resisted all of it quietly. Rather than rebel openly, she refined her refusal. She chose roles that allowed moral complexity, women torn between duty and desire, conscience and longing. That choice earned admiration, but it also created isolation. Hollywood rewarded those who surrendered themselves fully to myth. Kerr never did. She remained visible, celebrated, yet subtly apart. Marriage, for Kerr, was initially an attempt to anchor herself against the centrifugal force of fame. Her union with Anthony Bartley carried the promise of balance, a decorated war pilot offering grounding to a rising star. Yet as her career expanded across continents, the imbalance grew impossible to ignore. Success altered the architecture of their relationship. Admiration turned to resentment. Absence turned to distance. Kerr endured this strain with the same composure she displayed on screen, but endurance does not erase erosion. By the time the marriage ended, she had learned another lesson. Stability could not be borrowed from someone else. It had to be built inwardly. Her second marriage to Peter Vertel reflected that understanding. It was quieter, more cerebral, rooted in shared intellectual rhythms rather than public image. Together, they constructed a life deliberately removed from Hollywood's noise, dividing their time between countries, choosing privacy over proximity to power. For Kerr, this was not retreat, but reclamation. She had spent years being watched. Now she chose when and how she would be seen. It was within this context of self-possession that her partnership with Burt Lancaster must be understood. When they worked together, the contrast between them was immediate and unavoidable. Lancaster arrived with the force of someone who had never learned to contain himself. A former acrobat, physically fearless, emotionally expansive, he trusted his instincts absolutely. Where Kerr refined, Lancaster confronted. Where she held silence, he filled space. Their chemistry was not accidental. It was the friction of opposites. To outsiders, this friction appeared romantic, almost mythic. Two beautiful people colliding beneath studio lights, embodying forbidden desire. But Kerr experienced it differently. For her, working opposite Lancaster required vigilance. His intensity did not switch off. It followed him into rehearsals, discussions, disagreements. He challenged authority reflexively, not as strategy, but as impulse. This refusal to submit thrilled directors and terrified producers. Kerr saw it for what it was, a man at war with limitation itself. Her upbringing had taught her that boundaries were not obstacles but protections. Lancaster treated boundaries as insults. That difference shaped every interaction between them. Kerr admired his courage and his refusal to compromise creatively, yet she recognized the danger of being drawn too close. Emotional proximity to someone who lived without breaks risked collapse. She chose distance not out of fear, but out of self-knowledge. The rumors that followed them were inevitable. Hollywood required narratives that simplified complexity. A great on-screen romance demanded an off-screen echo. Kerr declined to provide it. She understood that attraction did not require surrender, and that professionalism did not negate emotional truth. There was connection between them, she admitted later, but it was bounded, conscious, and restrained. That restraint disappointed audiences hungry for scandal. It also preserved her autonomy. As the years passed, Kerr observed Lancaster from a distance, watching how the very qualities that fueled his greatness began to weigh on him. His anger, which she identified early, was not aimed at people so much as at the idea of being constrained. Age, injury, and the slow weakening of his body confronted him with the one opponent he could not overpower. For a man whose identity was inseparable from physical command, this confrontation was devastating. Kerr spoke of this with quiet sorrow, not triumph. She did not frame his decline as punishment, but as tragedy. The body he trusted betrayed him, and with it, the certainty that had carried him through decades of defiance. She recognized that his brilliance had always been tied to this intensity, and that removing it would have meant removing the man himself. There was no version of Lancaster that could have aged gently. Her reflections were shaped by her own confrontation with limitation. Parkinson's disease gradually narrowed her physical world, challenging the discipline that had defined her life. Yet she faced this erosion differently. Accustomed to restraint, she adapted. Where Lancaster raged against loss, Kerr accepted it with measured resolve. This contrast deepened her understanding of what they had shared. They were not opposites who misunderstood each other. They were opposites who saw each other clearly. The past, for Deborah Kerr, was never a place of indulgent memory. It was a ledger of choices made and boundaries honored. In speaking honestly about Burt Lancaster, she was not correcting the record for gossip's sake. She was articulating a philosophy forged through experience. That intensity can elevate, but it can also consume. That restraint can protect, but it can also isolate. Their partnership existed in the narrow space between those truths. By the time she allowed these reflections to surface, Kerr had little left to prove. Awards, admiration, and legacy had already settled around her. What remained was the need to tell the truth without embellishment. Not to shock, but to clarify. Not to diminish a legend, but to return him to human scale. In doing so, she revealed as much about herself as she did about him. A woman who survived Hollywood not by surrendering to its myths, but by understanding their cost and choosing, again and again, to stand just far enough away to remain whole. Deborah Kerr reached the moment of reckoning not through scandal, but through accumulation. By the time she began to speak with unguarded honesty about the years that followed her most celebrated work, the events themselves were long past. What remained was not the memory of applause or headlines, but the quieter residue of strain that lingers when intensity has been endured rather than indulged. The world had preserved a single image of her partnership with Burt Lancaster, endlessly replayed and reduced to romance. Kerr understood that this simplification erased the true cost of standing beside a force that never rested. As the years unfolded after their defining collaboration, Kerr returned repeatedly to projects that demanded moral gravity rather than spectacle. She gravitated toward roles that allowed silence to speak louder than gesture, as if counterbalancing the overwhelming energy she had once faced. Colleagues observed a subtle shift in her working habits. She became more deliberate, more selective, less willing to place herself in environments where volatility was mistaken for passion. This was not retreat. It was recalibration. She had learned that not every fire needed to be touched to be understood. Lancaster, meanwhile, moved in the opposite direction. His career became increasingly defined by confrontation, both creative and personal. He argued with directors, challenged scripts publicly, and refused to temper his opinions for diplomacy. To audiences, this defiance read as authenticity. To studios, it was liability. Kerr watched from afar, recognizing a familiar pattern. The same force that electrified screens was burning bridges behind the scenes. Where she had learned to preserve herself through restraint, Lancaster pressed harder, convinced that intensity was the only honest currency. The contrast sharpened with time. Kerr's personal life settled into a rhythm that valued privacy and intellectual companionship. She divided her life geographically, choosing spaces that allowed distance from Hollywood's relentless gaze. In these quieter settings, she reflected on the past with clarity rather than nostalgia. When asked about Lancaster, she did not hesitate, but she also did not embellish. She spoke of admiration, respect, and unease in equal measure. She acknowledged attraction without romance, closeness without surrender. For many listeners, this restraint felt unsatisfying. They wanted revelation to mean confession. Kerr offered analysis instead. The shock, when it came, was not explosive. It arrived through understatement. Kerr revealed that working with Lancaster required a constant negotiation of boundaries. His intensity, she explained, did not pause for reflection. It surged forward, demanding engagement whether one was prepared or not. On set, this translated into performances of undeniable power. Off-set, it created an atmosphere where exhaustion was inevitable. Kerr described moments of feeling overwhelmed, not by cruelty, but by volume. Lancaster did not intend to dominate. He simply did not know how to be otherwise. This admission reframed decades of myth-making. The legendary chemistry audiences revered was revealed as something more precarious. It was not a shared fantasy, but a sustained effort to maintain equilibrium. Kerr met Lancaster's force with discipline, matching his presence without mirroring his chaos. She understood that if she allowed herself to be swept into his rhythm, she would lose the control that had carried her safely through an industry that consumed less guarded women. Her decision to hold back was misread as emotional distance. In truth, it was survival. As Lancaster aged, the consequences of his approach became unavoidable. The physical decline that accompanied later life struck him with particular cruelty. For a man who trusted his body as proof of self, weakness felt like erasure. Kerr spoke of this period with deep empathy. She recognized the terror beneath his anger, the fear of becoming ordinary in a world that had rewarded excess. Where she adapted quietly to limitation, he resisted it openly. This resistance intensified his suffering. Kerr did not frame this as moral failure. She framed it as inevitability. A life lived at full volume cannot fade gently. Her own confrontation with illness sharpened this understanding. Parkinson's disease forced her to renegotiate the relationship between mind and body she had mastered since ballet training. Yet she approached this erosion with the same discipline that had shaped her career. She accepted assistance, adjusted routines, and retreated further for public life. In doing so, she preserved dignity without spectacle. Observers noted the contrast. Lancaster fought decline as an enemy. Kerr treated it as a condition to be managed. This difference illuminated the core of what separated them all along. When Kerr finally articulated these reflections, some were disappointed by the absence of scandal. There was no revelation of betrayal, no hidden romance exposed. What she offered instead was a portrait of collaboration under pressure. She acknowledged that Lancaster made her braver, forced her to meet his intensity rather than retreat from it. Yet she also made clear that bravery had limits. Courage did not require self-destruction. She drew that line early and held it consistently. In the broader context of Hollywood's golden age, Kerr's honesty stood apart. The era thrived on illusion, on carefully maintained narratives that protected icons from complexity. By speaking plainly, she disrupted this tradition. She returned Lancaster to human scale, neither saint nor monster, but a man whose brilliance was inseparable from his flaws. In doing so, she also reclaimed her own story. She refused to be remembered solely as one half of a romantic image. She asserted herself as a conscious participant who chose boundaries over mythology. The weight of this truth settled slowly. Viewers who listened closely began to understand that the tragedy lay not in what never happened between them, but in what always hovered at the edge. The possibility of surrender. The danger of losing oneself in another's fire. Kerr's restraint preserved her, but it also carried loneliness. Lancaster's intensity elevated him, but also isolated him. Their paths intersected briefly, brilliantly, and then diverged, each carrying the mark of that encounter in different ways. By the time Kerr's voice grew faint and her public appearances ceased, her reflections had already done their work. They stripped away fantasy and replaced it with understanding. In the end, the truth she revealed was not designed to shock, but to endure. It suggested that greatness demands choices, and that survival within greatness demands even more. For Deborah Kerr, speaking this truth was an act of completion. She had lived with it privately for decades. Sharing it allowed the story to end not with illusion, but with clarity. Deborah Kerr carried the consequences of that defining encounter not as open wounds, but as permanent recalibrations. The impact did not announce itself through public collapse or dramatic withdrawal. It manifested quietly in the way she chose work, the way she managed distance, and the way she protected the interior life that Hollywood had so often demanded women surrender. Standing beside a man like Burt Lancaster had taught her a lesson few were willing to articulate. Intensity, when left unchecked, does not merely exhaust those who wield it. It reshapes everyone within its radius. In the years that followed, Kerr's performances deepened in restraint rather than spectacle. She became known for roles where moral tension replaced physical drama, where silence carried more weight than confrontation. Critics praised her elegance, but few recognized the discipline beneath it as a response to lived experience. She understood now that emotional excess was not proof of truth. Truth could exist in stillness. That understanding altered the trajectory of her career. She turned away from projects that thrived on volatility, choosing instead stories that allowed control without coldness. This was not avoidance. It was self-preservation refined into principle. The cost of this choice was subtle but enduring. By refusing to participate in the mythology that surrounded her most famous collaboration, Kerr accepted a certain degree of misinterpretation. Audiences clung to the fantasy of romance, disappointed by her refusal to confirm it. The industry, which rewarded sensational narratives, found her honesty inconvenient. Yet she did not correct the record aggressively. She allowed misunderstanding to linger, believing that clarity imposed too forcefully becomes another form of distortion. In that silence, she absorbed the consequence. Her image remained dignified but distant, admired but not consumed. Lancaster's path revealed the other side of the equation. His resistance to limitation intensified with age, and the consequences became increasingly visible. Professional conflicts multiplied. Physical decline undermined the foundation upon which he had built his sense of self. Where Kerr adapted inwardly, Lancaster confronted outwardly. His frustration became more pronounced, his anger less containable. Those around him felt the strain. Admirers sensed the shift, though few could articulate it. The man who had once embodied unstoppable force now wrestled with forces he could not overpower. Kerr observed this from a distance that was both protective and painful. She recognized the isolation that followed him, the narrowing circle of those able or willing to meet his intensity. Her reflections on his later years were marked by sorrow rather than judgment. She saw how the loss of physical certainty eroded him, stripping away the armor that had shielded deeper vulnerability. This erosion did not diminish his legacy, but it revealed its cost. Greatness, when built on relentless momentum, leaves little room for gentleness in decline. The contrast between their responses to limitation illuminated the broader impact of their encounter. Kerr's discipline, once forged in ballet and refined through loss, allowed her to meet adversity with measured acceptance. Parkinson's disease imposed its own demands, gradually restricting movement and independence. Yet she approached this challenge with the same composure that had defined her life. She adjusted routines, accepted assistance, and withdrew from public life without bitterness. Her dignity was not performative. It was practiced daily, in private moments unseen by audiences who remembered only her luminous past. For Lancaster, decline carried a more visible anguish. The betrayal of his body struck at the core of his identity. Kerr understood this pain intimately, even if she did not share his reaction to it. She spoke of the cruelty of that irony, of a man who trusted physical power above all else forced to confront its absence. Her words reframed his later struggles not as failure, but as the inevitable consequence of a life lived without moderation. In doing so, she extended compassion rather than critique. The broader impact of their story reached beyond personal trajectories. It exposed a fault line in Hollywood's construction of masculinity and femininity. Lancaster embodied a version of manhood celebrated for dominance and defiance. Kerr represented a form of strength rooted in restraint and moral clarity. Their collaboration revealed the tension between these ideals. The industry amplified the spectacle, ignoring the cost. Kerr's later honesty challenged that amplification. She suggested that admiration without understanding perpetuates harm, both to those idolized and those standing beside them. This reframing altered how her legacy was received by those willing to listen. Film historians began to reassess her career not merely as a series of elegant performances, but as a sustained negotiation of power within an unforgiving system. Her refusal to be consumed by myth became part of her contribution. She demonstrated that survival in Hollywood did not require surrender to excess. It required discernment. That discernment, however, often came at the price of intimacy with the public. Kerr accepted that trade. She chose coherence over adoration. Lancaster's legacy, viewed through her lens, gained complexity. He emerged not as a cautionary tale, but as a study in the limits of intensity. His brilliance remained undeniable. His influence endured. Yet the cost became visible in retrospect. The relationships strained, the conflicts accumulated, the solitude that accompanied decline. Kerr's reflections did not diminish him. They contextualized him, restoring balance to a narrative long skewed toward spectacle. The impact of their shared history thus unfolded on two levels. Individually, it shaped the choices they made long after the camera stopped. Collectively, it offered insight into an era that rewarded excess while overlooking its aftermath. Kerr's voice, calm and measured, cut through decades of romanticization. She reminded listeners that what appears effortless on screen often demands profound effort off it, and that those efforts leave marks that endure. As time narrowed her world and silence became more frequent, Kerr carried this understanding without urgency. She had no need to persuade. Her truth existed whether accepted or not. In that acceptance lay a final consequence. She allowed the story to stand as it was, complex and unresolved. Not a romance fulfilled or denied, but a collision that reshaped two lives in opposite ways. That recognition marked the true aftermath. Not the applause, not the image, but the quiet recalibration that followed, long after the lights dimmed. Deborah Kerr's life was punctuated by moments that the public seldom glimpsed, instances of quiet resilience and private negotiation that defined her both as a woman and as an artist. These stories, often overshadowed by her luminous screen presence, reveal a pattern of endurance that was as much about internal negotiation as it was about professional mastery. Friends and colleagues recalled her as someone whose attention to detail extended beyond the camera. She would rehearse silently in empty corridors, adjusting gestures and expressions until they felt exactly right, a discipline inherited from her early ballet training. Even in these private rituals, there was an unspoken tension, a commitment to perfection that demanded sacrifices few could recognize or appreciate. Every movement, every subtle expression, became a testament not only to skill but to the measured restraint that had safeguarded her throughout decades in the relentless spotlight of Hollywood. Offset, Kerr's personal life mirrored the balance she maintained professionally. Her first marriage to Anthony Bartley had been initially grounded in shared optimism and stability, yet the distance imposed by her rising stardom gradually strained the relationship. While the world imagined a conventional domestic life, Kerr navigated a complex emotional terrain, balancing affection, responsibility, and the subtle acknowledgement that her public life could never be entirely reconciled with her private one. Colleagues remembered her brief notes to family between filming schedules, small gestures of intimacy that carried enormous weight precisely because they were scarce. These gestures were not performative. They were acts of deliberate care, carefully measured to maintain the integrity of her domestic world amidst the unyielding demands of fame. The transition to her second marriage with Peter Vertel brought a different rhythm. Vertel, steeped in literary and artistic circles, offered companionship that resonated with Kerr's intellectual sensibilities. Yet this union, too, required adaptation. She embraced the role of stepmother with the same quiet diligence that had characterized her professional life, negotiating the blending of households and the rhythms of international residence. Friends recounted that Kerr approached these challenges with a patience and attentiveness that often went unnoticed. She did not seek applause for domestic success. She executed it with a meticulous discipline that mirrored her craft. Her private victories, though invisible to the public eye, were no less significant for the self-respect they preserved and for the lessons they offered in navigating complex relational dynamics. Her relationship with Burt Lancaster, preserved in memory rather than rumor, exemplifies the duality of her professional and private selves. On screen, their interactions conveyed passion and immediacy. Behind the scenes, Kerr's recollections reveal a calculated negotiation of presence and distance. She recognized Lancaster's formidable energy, his relentless drive, and the emotional intensity that accompanied both. Friends and fellow actors noted her composure when navigating this intensity, a composure rooted in years of disciplined self-management. She responded not with mimicry or surrender, but with measured engagement, a dance of boundaries that allowed collaboration without erosion of self. These episodes, unrecorded and unseen by the public, illustrate the quiet strategies Kerr employed to maintain both artistic excellence and personal integrity under conditions of extraordinary pressure. In these unseen moments, Kerr confronted the full complexity of human relationships shaped by professional intensity. Her observations about Lancaster extended beyond admiration to nuanced recognition of his vulnerabilities. She described the ferocity with which he pursued authenticity, the unyielding standards he imposed upon himself and those around him, and the subtle fragility hidden beneath his commanding exterior. Friends recalled her speaking about these dynamics with careful precision, neither embellishing nor diminishing them. Her insights emphasized that brilliance carries a weight that can challenge not only the individual but everyone in proximity, and that surviving in such an environment demands both courage and discipline. These private narratives also encompass her own confrontation with aging and illness. Parkinson's disease gradually imposed constraints on her body, echoing the challenges she had witnessed in others, including Lancaster. Kerr's response, however, remained consistent with the patterns established throughout her life. She adapted routines, sought assistance strategically, and retreated from public engagements not from fear or resignation, but from a clear assessment of her capacities and priorities. Observers who visited her in later years noted the deliberate calm in her demeanor, the attention to detail in daily tasks, and the acceptance that some domains could no longer be managed as before. These measures were acts of agency, reinforcing her autonomy and her ability to navigate a world that increasingly demanded accommodation. The impact of these quiet acts extended into her family and professional legacy. Kerr's daughters and grandchildren observed her discipline, her attentiveness, and her capacity to maintain dignity under duress. Her guidance shaped not only domestic life but also the values imparted to future generations, reinforcing resilience, responsibility, and measured engagement with the world. In this way, the lessons Kerr embodied were transmitted silently, through example rather than instruction, embedding principles of perseverance and thoughtful action in a family life as enduring as her cinematic achievements. Kerr's reflections on Lancaster and their collaboration further illuminate her capacity for understanding complexity without resorting to simplification. She acknowledged attraction, mutual respect, and shared intensity, but she also emphasized boundaries and self-preservation. The dichotomy between their approaches, Lancaster's unrestrained energy and her deliberate control, reveals the subtle forms of negotiation required to sustain both collaboration and personal integrity. Her candid observations do not diminish the admiration she felt. Rather, they place it in context, highlighting the human costs of brilliance and the discipline required to coexist with it safely. Through these accounts, the audience gains insight into the unglamorous realities underlying Hollywood legend. Kerr's life illustrates that mastery of one's craft involves mastery of oneself, that professional excellence requires emotional intelligence, and that sustaining human relationships demands continuous, sometimes unseen effort. These stories, though private, underscore the interplay between talent, personality, and circumstance, revealing the intricate dynamics that define collaboration at the highest levels of artistry. They remind viewers that resilience is cultivated in the quiet moments, in decisions that are never captured on film, and in the careful maintenance of boundaries amidst pressures that are both relentless and seductive. Kerr's enduring legacy rests not only on her performances, but also on the choices she made in navigating personal and professional landscapes. The measured courage with which she engaged extraordinary intensity, the deliberate cultivation of privacy and autonomy, and the subtle attention to relational dynamics collectively compose a narrative of strength that is intimate, nuanced, and instructive. These stories, largely untold to the public during her life, provide a deeper understanding of her character, revealing that the drama behind the screen was often internal, carefully managed, and resolved with the same artistry that defined her cinematic expression. Deborah Kerr's life invites reflection on the interplay between achievement and sacrifice, on the subtle ways in which brilliance shapes and constrains those who embody it. Her career, spanning over 5 decades, reflects not only an extraordinary command of craft, but also a conscious navigation of the costs associated with fame. Each role she undertook demanded precision, empathy, and emotional intelligence. Audiences admired the elegance of her performances, but few recognized the internal labor behind that elegance. The same discipline that allowed her to perform with impeccable timing and poise also enabled her to withstand the pressures of an industry that often demanded surrender to spectacle. Her resilience was a quiet legacy, one that extended beyond awards or accolades into the subtle art of maintaining selfhood amidst public scrutiny. Kerr's reflections on her collaboration with Burt Lancaster offer insights into the nature of human interaction under extraordinary circumstances. Lancaster, with his uncontainable energy and uncompromising approach, exemplified the extremities of professional intensity. Kerr, by contrast, navigated these conditions through deliberate restraint and keen awareness of boundaries. Her ability to recognize both the brilliance and the burden of Lancaster's presence demonstrates a nuanced understanding of human behavior. She saw that his force, while electrifying on screen, carried consequences off it, an exhaustion, a subtle erosion of equilibrium that could overwhelm those who lack preparation or discipline. Her capacity to endure, to engage without surrendering herself, exemplifies a principle that resonates throughout her life. True mastery of craft involves mastery of self. This principle extended beyond professional encounters into her private life. Kerr's marriages and family experiences illustrate the deliberate attention she paid to sustaining relationships while preserving autonomy. Her first marriage, marked by both affection and eventual strain, revealed the tensions that arise when personal aspirations intersect with external recognition and acclaim. Her second marriage, more aligned with her intellectual and creative sensibilities, reflects a conscious choice to cultivate partnership based on shared values rather than societal expectation. Through these experiences, Kerr demonstrated that agency over one's choices, one's presence, and one's response to intensity is fundamental to enduring both success and complexity. The interplay of vulnerability and strength is a recurring motif in Kerr's story. While she embodied grace and composure publicly, she was acutely aware of the limits imposed by physical and emotional reality. Parkinson's disease, which gradually constrained her mobility and independence, tested her capacity for adaptation. Yet she approached this challenge with the same careful measurement that had defined her career. Where others might have viewed limitation as defeat, Kerr reframed it as an opportunity for strategic adjustment and reflection. This approach reinforces a broader insight evident throughout her life. Resilience is cultivated through awareness, discipline, and deliberate choice, rather than through denial or resistance alone. Kerr's legacy is inseparable from the narrative she constructed through action, example, and discernment. Her approach to collaboration, to family, and to personal challenges illustrates a consistent ethic of integrity. By maintaining boundaries while engaging fully with the demands of her craft, she demonstrated that excellence does not require self-erasure. Her measured courage in the face of intense external and internal forces provides a template for understanding the balance between engagement and preservation. In recognizing both her own limits and the extraordinary qualities of those around her, Kerr exemplified a form of wisdom that transcends performance and speaks to the broader human condition. The culmination of her reflections also sheds light on the emotional architecture of genius and intensity. Observing Lancaster's life and decline, she recognized the inherent vulnerabilities that accompany unrestrained force. His brilliance was inseparable from his intensity, yet that same intensity carried costs: physical, relational, and emotional. Kerr's own choices illustrate the converse. Discipline and measured engagement enable endurance and sustained contribution, even in contexts where chaos or pressure might overwhelm others. In this contrast, the audience gains insight into the interdependence of personality, circumstance, and professional achievement. Kerr's enduring influence is further evident in the transmission of values to subsequent generations. Her children and grandchildren inherited more than artistic inclination. They inherited a model of measured engagement, thoughtful decision-making, and deliberate self-preservation. The lessons embedded in her approach to work, collaboration, and life extend beyond the domain of cinema, offering enduring guidance on navigating complex human systems and relationships. Through example rather than prescription, she cultivated resilience, insight, and ethical clarity in those who followed. Ultimately, Kerr's story invites contemplation on the nature of human effort, the ethical dimensions of interaction under pressure, and the ways in which personal integrity shapes legacy. Her life exemplifies a rare combination of brilliance, discipline, and empathy. By observing and engaging with intensity without surrendering to it, she preserved both her art and her selfhood. In reflecting on her career and her relationships, including those with figures as formidable as Burt Lancaster, one recognizes that the truest measure of legacy is not merely public admiration or critical acclaim, but the careful navigation of complexity with dignity, insight, and resilience. Through the lens of her experience, we are reminded that excellence carries both opportunity and responsibility, that proximity to intensity demands discernment, and that the cultivation of integrity is itself a form of artistry. Deborah Kerr's life offers a meditation on these principles, illustrating that the subtleties of choice, attention, and self-awareness can yield a legacy as profound and enduring as the most celebrated performance on screen. Her story, lived quietly and reflected upon deeply, provides insight not only into the nature of celebrity, but into the human capacity for balance, understanding, and graceful endurance. Deborah Kerr's final years were marked by a deliberate retreat from the glare of public attention, a conscious choice to inhabit spaces where the weight of history and expectation could not intrude. In the quiet of her home in Boatsdale, England, she confronted the slow erosion imposed by Parkinson's disease with the same meticulous grace that had defined her career and her life. Each movement, each decision, carried the imprint of decades of disciplined attention. Friends visiting her in those final years remarked upon the serenity that pervaded her surroundings, the careful arrangement of objects, the precision in her gestures. It was not the spectacle of accomplishment, nor the trappings of fame, that dominated her environment, but the enduring principles that had guided her through both triumph and turbulence. Even as physical limitation grew, Kerr's engagement with the world remained deliberate. She continued to reflect upon her experiences, particularly her work alongside Burt Lancaster, not in pursuit of public sensationalism, but in search of understanding. She emphasized the human dimensions of their partnership, the intensity, the brilliance, the vulnerabilities that coexisted beneath the persona that audiences revered. In these reflections, Lancaster was neither idolized nor diminished. He was rendered as fully human, a man whose drive and energy had shaped both his art and the experience of those who worked beside him. Kerr's candor underscored the notion that greatness carries with it a complexity rarely captured in legend, a complexity that exacts both admiration and cost. Her narrative also illuminates the intricate balance between personal integrity and professional excellence. Throughout her life, Kerr had negotiated environments that demanded compromise, often against the backdrop of unrelenting public scrutiny. It is in this careful calibration that her lasting influence emerges. She modeled a form of resilience that privileges clarity and self-possession over surrender to circumstance or expectation. The impact of her decisions extended into her family, shaping both immediate and extended relationships. Kerr's daughters and grandchildren observed her unwavering commitment to discipline, her subtle attention to ethical and emotional detail, and her capacity to maintain poise under pressure. These lessons, imparted silently through example rather than through direct instruction, cultivated a framework of resilience and thoughtful engagement that persisted beyond her personal and professional achievements. The legacy of influence, thus, was not merely cinematic but deeply human, reflecting an ethos of measured response and considered action. Kerr's reflections on Lancaster further elucidate the dynamics of human interaction under conditions of exceptional intensity. Her acknowledgement of his brilliance, coupled with her recognition of its burdens, offers insight into the necessity of boundaries in sustaining collaboration and well-being. By maintaining her own equilibrium while engaging with his force, she preserved her autonomy and ensured the integrity of her contribution. This pattern exemplifies a broader principle. The proximity of power and intensity requires both discernment and fortitude, qualities that Kerr embodied consistently. Her observations transform what could be interpreted as anecdotal memory into instructive analysis, offering perspective on the ethical and psychological demands inherent in partnership with extraordinary talent. Her later reflections also cast light on the human costs of relentless engagement with one's craft. Lancaster's eventual confrontation with physical decline illustrates the vulnerabilities that accompany even the most disciplined or formidable individuals. Kerr's perspective, shaped by her own experience with illness and aging, emphasized empathy and understanding over judgment. She recognized that the pressures which had forged brilliance in youth could become sources of profound challenge in later life. Her insights reveal the duality inherent in intensity. It elevates and inspires, yet it exacts a toll that is often invisible to observers. Ultimately, Kerr's story, as revealed in her final reflections, offers a meditation on the nature of legacy. It is not confined to accolades or public recognition, nor is it defined solely by the preservation of image. Instead, her legacy emerges through the careful integration of talent, ethical engagement, and self-awareness. The choices she made, what to reveal, what to withhold, how to navigate intensity, how to preserve autonomy, constitute a framework for understanding the intersection of personal integrity and professional accomplishment. Her life demonstrates that the endurance of influence rests not solely on visibility, but on the cultivation of consistency, dignity, and clarity across all domains of experience. In the quietude of her later years, Kerr exemplified the culmination of these principles. Her retreat from the public was not a withdrawal from relevance, but an assertion of agency and discernment. The narrative she crafted, both in her performances and in her reflections on partnerships, reveals the nuanced reality behind the mythic images that captivated generations. It underscores the importance of understanding, empathy, and resilience in sustaining both artistry and humanity. Through this lens, Deborah Kerr's story resonates as a testament to the capacity for grace under pressure, for disciplined engagement with the world, and for the preservation of selfhood amidst extraordinary circumstances. In the end, Kerr's life and reflections transform the understanding of collaboration, intensity, and legacy. Her observations on Burt Lancaster reveal not only the challenges of working alongside exceptional force, but also the broader implications for navigating complex relationships and sustaining integrity. Her final years, marked by measured retreat and careful reflection, demonstrate that dignity and understanding can endure where spectacle and legend fade. Through her choices, her discipline, and her candor, Deborah Kerr leaves a legacy defined by both human depth and artistic excellence, a quiet yet enduring testament to the interplay between brilliance and restraint.